So I'm going to do a little bit something different this morning. Instead of getting into Philippians again this morning, we're going to take a break. Lord willing, we'll come back to it next week. But take your Bibles and turn to the book of Lamentations chapter 3. Lamentations chapter 3, you'll see the notes there. It can be, if you don't have a Bible this morning, there is a Bible in front of you in the pocket, and our passage can be found on page 817 and 818. With everything going on with our family and everything like that, I just kind of went back and focused on some of the notes I had about the character of God this week. And in doing that, as I was working on redoing some of the sermon from last week that I didn't preach, since I wasn't here, I just felt that I wanted to focus more on who God is this morning. And I think from talking to people this week and also even this morning, that I think this was God's pushing me to understand that God is faithful. That we serve a God who is faithful. And I think this passage here that we see in the book of Lamentations shows us, reminds us of the character of God. So as you're trying to find that today, if you don't know where Lamentations is, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah. Lamentations is a small book right before you get to the book of Ezekiel, then Daniel. But there's a story about Spurgeon as he was walking in the countryside with one of his friends. And he says, as they strode along, the evangelist noticed a barn with a weather vane upon its roof. And at the top of the weather vane, there were the words, "God is love." Spurgeon remarked to his companions that he thought that this was rather an appropriate place for such a message. Spurgeon says, weather vanes are changeable, he said, but God's love is constant. Spurgeon's friend says, I don't agree with you about these words, Charles. You misunderstand the meaning. He says that the sign is indicating a truth, that regardless of which way the wind blows, God is love. I've used that illustration before, but I think that's perfect. You think about, we go through life, go through the week, day in and day out, and we wake up and sometimes the winds of what is happening around us just blow us from side to side. It just seems like that there's just no stable ground. It seems like something comes up and the wind pushes us a different way. We have all these plans, we have all these things to be faithful, whatever it may be, and we are blown off course of our walk with God. But what we see is that no matter what happens, God is constant. No matter the changing things in our life and the uncontrollable things in our life, we worship a God who is loving, and his love never changes. That's exactly what we see in the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is a book of 5 funeral poems, dirges. And what we see is that normally what we see, you read it and say, well, Pastor, this doesn't look like poetry to me. There's no rhyming in this poetry. We sit there and says, roses are red, violets are blue. I give you these flowers because I love you. We like that rhyming piece. But in the Bible, if you look at a lot of poetry, there's no rhyme to it. In fact, what happens is that you don't see it necessarily as we read it, but if you were to read it in original Hebrew, you would see that it's poetry because each line begins with the letter of the alphabet. And if you go through and we're not going to go through the whole book. We're only going to look at a couple verses here today. But there are 5 chapters. Every chapter has 22 verses except for chapter 3, which has 66 verses. So they take the 22 verses because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and each one is an acrostic. So you're starting this, and each line starts with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. We see that sometimes in the Psalms, and Psalm 119 is the same way. It's structured to be that way. It's that poetry. And what we see is that this is all true except for chapter 3, which has 66 verses. But it repeats itself 3 times. And what we see is that a third of the way through the 3rd chapter, we see the focus of what Jeremiah was trying to tell his people, that he would tell himself, preaching to himself and preaching to the people that are facing the destruction of Jerusalem, facing the death of their family members, facing starvation, facing being sent away to a foreign land. And we see that this book tells us about God's faithfulness. He's honest. He doesn't gloss over evil and suffering and hardship. But it describes, if you read through this book, so if you want to read through this book this week, very easy. It's easy because there's not a lot there. It's hard because of the subject matter. He deals with war and destruction, rape and pillaging, human trafficking, starvation. Basically, every single crime and evil known to man is kind of talked about in this book. They're described. They're lamented. But what he does is that he sits there and says that this is God's faithfulness. He focuses on, so what is God's faithfulness? It's basically, as A.W. Tozer says, it is that God, it's that inside God which guarantees that he will never be or act inconsistent with himself. You see, God is a loving God and he never acts in an unloving way. God is an honest God and he never acts in a devious or dishonest way. You know, we are all used to people who, in our lives, that as we go through life, we try to emulate the character of Christ. We try to decide to be holy like God is holy, but there's going to be times when we're going to share untruths. We're going to lie. We're going to be dishonest. There are times when we're going to let people down because of our own frailty, because it's too hard to be there to support them. There are going to be times when we are betrayed by our friends and family. But Jeremiah is telling us here, sharing with us here, that there is a God who never, ever acts in a way that is contrary to who he is. God being who he is cannot cease to be what he is. He is at once faithful and immutable, which is unchanging, so his words and acts must be and must remain faithful. God is a faithful God. That means that he says, and what he says and does is certain. He is 100% reliable 100% of the time. So what does that mean for us? Look at Lamentations 3, 19 through 24. We're not going to read all 27 verses. I want to focus on this here. So in chapter 3, which is the focal point of the book, we see Jeremiah bears his heart out to God. The things that are happening to him, he just lays it out. The things that are happening to his people, he just lays it out to God. Look what he says. Remember my afflictions and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will have hope in him. Now, we all sit there and say, well, that's exactly what the hymn, great is thy faithfulness. Exactly. That's how we're going to end our service today. After the sermon, that's what we're going to do. We're going to celebrate and worship the faithfulness of God by singing that back to him. But what I want to focus on today, I think what Jeremiah tells us is this main thing, is that as we go through life, we need to focus on God's faithfulness, not our frustrations. We need to focus on who God is, who he has been to us, what he has done for us, what he continues to do for us. Focus on his character. Focus on his actions instead of our frustrations. So it's not that. So as we look at that, this is easier said than done, right? We wake up and our whole body is racked with pain. What do? We're looking for that Tylenol. We're looking for that Advil, and we're just complaining. So it's so hard not to wallow in our frustrations and hardships. But I think what we see is in these, especially these verses here, we see an example of how we are to deal with those frustrations in life by focusing on who God is. The first thing that we see that Jeremiah does is that he lists his laments. He catalogs his grief. He's brutally honest with himself. He's brutally honest with God, saying, God, this is how I feel. You ever been that way that you just want to share how you feel with somebody? And it's not so that they can fix it. It's not so that they can make you feel better. You just want to have your feelings known. This is exactly what Jeremiah does. And I think this is an important first step, is to sit there and to be honest about the hardships, the frustrations that we have. It's not necessarily, there's a point to where we can focus so much on our problems that that's all we deal about. And that brings depression and frustration and anxiety. But I think the Bible shares with us that it's important to be honest with others and honest with God about how we feel. Think about it. If you read through the book of Psalms, a third of the Psalms are songs of sadness. Something has happened to the psalmist, the author, the one who writes it, or something is going on in his family, or something's going on in the nation of Israel, and a psalm of sadness, a psalm of lament is written. A third of them. So you have 150 of these, so around 50, over 50 of these psalms are not, we're happy, joyfully, and everything's going on. We put on a mask when we go to the temple. No, these are psalms that are crying out to God, says, Lord, this is what's happening to my life. In fact, there are more psalms of sadness, lament, than any other category in life. Jeremiah is asking God to recall that his life is filled with frustration. The word affliction means trouble or misery. This idea of wanderings refers to being homeless or restless. We don't use the word wormwood very much unless we're talking about some type of rock in space that's coming to earth. But wormwood is a harmful plant that symbolizes bitterness. Gall is the same thing. It's like a poisonous, life-threatening substance. So I think what Jeremiah does is that it just smacks in the face, charges in the face of this happy, don't worry, be happy lifestyle that we have. We get up and we go to job, we go do our things, we go to our job, we do our things in life, and everything's okay. We put on this mask. We're not honest with ourselves, we're not honest with others, we're not honest with God. But Jeremiah breaks that action in half. And this is what he does. He lists all of his problems. So look at this. Look at verses 2 and 3 of Lamentations 3. It says, he has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely again he turns his head again and again the whole day long. The first thing that we see is that Jeremiah feels alone. Everybody has left him. No one is there to console him. No one is there to help him through his problems. He feels so alone. He's overwhelmed by the darkness that there's no hope in the light. Not only that, but then you go on and look at verse 4. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. Not only that, but we see that he is tormented mentally and physically. The things that are going on in his life he's being tormented, and that's causing him sickness, both mental sickness and physical sickness. And then in verse 5, he says, he has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. We see that no matter where Jeremiah turns, no matter what is where he thinks he has some allies, he turns there and it's empty. he cannot find relief no matter what he does or where he goes. I mean, this is a lot. Can you now remember who Jeremiah is? He is the prophet of God. He has been spoken to directly by God to preach God's literal words. Thus saith the Lord. So we can't sit there and say, well, Jeremiah, the reason why you're in this pit of despair, the reason why you're doing this is because you're not doing the will of God. He is doing the will of God. He's doing everything that God has told him, and what's happening? His audience is spitting in his face. His audience is actually cutting up the book that he wrote, throwing it in the fire. They refuse to listen to him. He is mocked. And that's exactly what we see. Look at verse 8. He goes on and says, though I call and cry out for help, he shuts me out of my prayer. He feels so alone that he feels like God is not even there, that God is not listening. Now, is that true? No. Does God ever leave his children? We can understand that even though it may not seem like it, Jeremiah is a child of God. God has not left him. But there will be some times in our life that we will experience like that. We are so alone that God has turned his back on it. I think John of the Cross wrote it one time. It says it's the dark night of the soul. The things that are happening to us, they feel so terrible that they feel like that everyone, not only humanly, but God has even turned her back on us. That's what he feels like. Now look at verse 14. Of Lamentations 3, he says, I have become the laughingstock of all people, the object of their taunts all day long. The very thing that God is telling him to do, he is being faithful, but yet the people are making fun of him. People make fun of him. And then we also see in verse 18, all this is leading to this idea of hopelessness. My endurance has perished, so has my hope from the Lord. He feels there is no future. He's hopeless. He's laying this out. He's being honest with himself. He's replaying the problems to God. And it has sent him to a really dark place. Because look at verse 20. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 20. This is what it says. My soul continually remembers it, and it's bowed down within me. I like how the New Living Translation says this. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. He's basically saying that what has happened to me has been so great. It's not just something I can wait for a little bit of time and go on. They always says time heals all heartache. That's not the situation with Jeremiah. That's not the situation with a lot of us, I think. That there are things that we have done, that we have encountered, that have been done to us, that there's not necessarily going to be, just allow time to pass and it will get better. No, that heartache, that frustration, that hardship is always going to be with you. It's exactly what Jeremiah says. It is bowed down within me. The grief over my loss is something I can't do. It's continually, Jeremiah is always rehearsing these laments, rehearsing these hardships in his mind. So I think what we need to understand is this idea that that sometimes listing your laments is beneficial, but dwelling on them time and time again can lead to discouragement and despair. And this is exactly where Jeremiah was. Whether in his own life, he sees ridicule, he sees the job that God has for him, that nobody's responding to his preaching. In fact, it seems like the more he preaches, the more evil the people become. The more he does what God says to do, just brings more ridicule and hardship upon his life, and people don't care. And if he's just, he is so focused upon his laments that it brings him to a dark place. That yes, we need to be honest about our feelings. We need to be honest about what's going on in our life, and we need to cry out to God. Just like it says that cast all your cares upon him. We need to sit there and cast all of our frustrations upon God. We don't need to hold them back. It's not because he doesn't know them, but there is a benefit that we are honest with ourselves, and Lord, we cry out for help. But if we stop there, we get stuck. And if we stop there, then all happens is we go into this cycle of just continually replaying our griefs over and over and over again. We are called to cast all of our cares upon Christ and allow him to take care of it. You see, Jeremiah had every reason to sing the blues and just basically walk away from his faith. But the one thing he did is that he sat there and was honest with himself, and he was honest with God. And guess what? He took the next step, and in his deepest darkness, as he wallowed in all the things that were happening to him, he decided to take the thing, and he forced himself to think about God's character, about who he was. He latched on not to the emptiness of his soul, emptiness of his life, but he latched on to God when his world was falling apart. This is how Jeremiah focused on God's faithfulness and character, not his frustration. So what we see is that as we are listing our laments, as we are honest, we don't need to stop there. That's just we need to be honest, and we need to continually to make the decision to consider the character of God. Consider who God is. And not necessarily focus on all the hardship, but focus on who God is. You know, we are really good at focusing on the negative, aren't we? We sit there and we get up and we can focus on all the negative of life, all the things that we have to do today. We go out and we don't get good customer service at Walmart. Yeah, we're in line, and the stock and the person who's in front of us is really slow writing a check, and it won't go through. But we have a lot of things to do, so we focus on all the negatives, the hardships of life, and that's kind of not really hardships in real life. It's just we're just our day isn't going as exactly what we wanted to do. So instead of focusing on the negative, Jeremiah focuses on God's character. Look at verse 21, Jeremiah 3:21. And this is the hinge of the book. But this I call to mind, therefore I have hope. We just see that he was hopeless. So what causes him to have hope? So the word but there serves as a contrast to what Jeremiah has been doing. He's been rehearsing all of his frustrations, all of his hardships. And now what he's doing, he's making a choice, but I call this to mind. It's the idea of doing something again, or returning, or bringing back. It literally means I make it to return to my heart. Jeremiah is being intentional. He's forcing himself to focus not on just what is true about his situation, but what is true about the character of God. He's not minimizing his troubles. He's not denying his sufferings, but he's making a choice not to dwell on them, but instead choosing to remember who God is. While his outward affliction and inward turmoil pushes him towards despair, Jeremiah forces himself to bring truth to the forefront of his mind. We all see this. How many times has our computer, our tablet, or our phone frozen to where we can't do anything with it? Ever had that happen? Just this morning, I don't know how many times I had to reload our computer just because it wasn't acting right. Something was happening. Something was getting in the way of the matrix. So what happens is that, what do? You turn it off. You do a hard reset to get back into the default. I think sometimes we don't recognize our minds that we slide down to the slippery slope of discouragement and despair. And if we don't reset it, if we don't put a stop to it, It just keeps going worse and worse and worse. In order to break out of our pattern of despair is that we need to be vigilant about how we see God, what God's character, what God's nature is in our life. Jeremiah did something that we need to do as well. We need to engage our will. We need to purposely and deliberately focus on God's promises, His nature, rather than our problems. We need to force ourselves to remember the truth of who God is. At the lowest point of Jeremiah's life, what did he do? Did he just wallow in despair? No. He forced himself to focus on God and His promises and not his problems. I think sometimes we need to force ourselves to remember the truth of who God is. We need to recall a verse that's special to us. We need to recall a time when God demonstrates His grace and mercy to you. We need to push God's attributes, His nature, His character to the forefront of our mind. They're always in the back. You know, we don't necessarily always forget them. We just don't choose to focus on them. They're always there. We need to begin to restore hope in our lives by crowding out the hopelessness that threatens to shipwreck our faith and our lives. And we need to focus on God's faithfulness, not our frustrations. So what does Jeremiah do? Look at verse 22. He says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. The first thing he does is that God is faithful in His love. God is faithful in His love. The word here for love is a word that means the idea of covenant love, loyal love. In the New Testament, it would be considered agape love. It's not something of feeling like God sits there and says, well, I just don't feel like loving you today. You know, you just made me mad, so I just don't feel like loving you today, so He turns His back. That's not the God we serve. That's not the God who loves us. God's love is a willful love that He chose to love us before the foundations of the world, and He sent His Son to save us. And that love can never end. That love is a steadfast love that no matter what happens to our life, no matter what we do in life, God never turns His back upon us. He is a faithful God. His love never ceases. His love never ceases. So instead of, again, what we see is that the promise of God's love needs to be at the forefront of our mind, knowing that no matter how hard things get because of what someone else has done or what we have done to ourselves, that there is nothing ever, that God is not going to break that relationship with us because He loves us. And that love is steadfast. It is rock solid and concrete. Then look at the end of verse 22. It says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. God is faithful even in His mercies. The word here, mercies, is plural. Why? Because it's so intense and so limitless. It comes in rolling waves from the very presence of God. It's this idea of compassion. That same word has its root word, the idea of the womb. Just as a mother loves and cares for that baby that's in the womb for 9 months, we see that gentle feeling of concern and care and love is what God has for us. God's compassion emanates deep from within Him and floods our life. He is moved with mercy when He thinks about us. And that mercy is not just a one-time event. Look at the beginning of verse 23. It says, they are new every morning. See, God is faithful, not just one time. He was not just faithful 10 years ago or yesterday, but Jeremiah promises that God is going to be faithful yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That when you think when you wake up and you think everything's okay, and all of a sudden, bam, you hit something and you think you can't go on, God's mercies are there. They are new every day. It's this idea of being fresh, never seen before. God gives us exactly what we need each day. Sometimes we need more mercy than we do before. Sometimes we need less. But whatever we need, God gives it to us. What does this mean? Is that as we wake up in life, as we encounter those laments, what do we need to do? We need to be honest about them, cry out to God, and then what happens is that we need to look and expect those new mercies to help us through those hardships. Every day may not be good, but there is something good in every day, as what someone said. He sends his mercies to meet our immediate needs every day.